It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this roundtable entitled Artificial Intelligence, Disinformation, and Elections, in which we intend to discuss the challenges generated by the new AI tools in the electoral environment. The roundtable is organized by the research group Comppit, Competition, Public Policy, Innovation, and Technology at FGV Law School. Before we start, just a quick disclaimer. And here I'd like to ask for, we start recording already. So the disclaimer is that manifestations expressed by members of the staff of Getúlio Vargas Foundation and by guests who participate in the events online represent exclusively the opinions of the authors and not necessarily the institutional position of FGV. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participation in this event spontaneously, and with that, authorize the use of the name, voice, and image, in addition to assigning the copyrights related to the exposure for this transmission that later will remain in the official channels of FGV. To continue with this transmission, we ask you to express your agreement by verbalizing or signal your agreement. Thank you very much for being here with us. With that out of the way, let's move to our topic today. So this is a very, very special year. We'll have elections in more than 60 countries affecting about half of the population of the world. These elections include Brazil, the European Union, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, South Africa, the United States, the UK, and tens of other countries that are going to go and have their populations go into the polls. These elections come in a context of acceleration of new artificial intelligence tools, more sophisticated and powerful than ever. Since November 2022, when the ChatGPT was first launched, we have seen a dramatic increase in the development and release of new versions of large language models, including GPT-4, Google's Gemini, and Meta's Llama 2. Also, developments in tools that create voice, images, and videos coming in a very fast pace. So these new tools will be available during this period of intense democratic activity and elections, impacting our information environment worldwide. These poses new issues and challenges to democracies. Let me introduce our stellar lineup of panelists to discuss these issues. So we've got with us Clara Iglesias Keller, research leader at the Weizenbaum Institute and the Berlin Social Science Center based in Berlin, Germany. Thank you, Clara, for being with us. We have Professor Claire Wardle, professor at Brown University and director of the Information Futures Lab based in Rhode Island, the US. Thanks, Claire. And we have Francisco Carvalho de Brito Cruz, Executive Director of Internet Lab, a think tank based in Brazil. And Magna Ball, research leader at Asia Center, a think tank in the area of policy and technology based in New Delhi, India. So we're literally covering here about 10 time zones today, with a major challenge to coordinate the schedules. So thank you very much for making the time and joining us here today. In order to start our conversation, I'd like to pass on to Francisco Brito Cruz in order to address how AI is transforming the information environment. So in a broader view, how it's affecting the ability of individuals to make political choices. Chico, you have the floor to kick off our conversation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Caio. It's a pleasure to be here with Clara, Claire, and Magno. 5 minutes is not a I would say not plenty much of time to try to limit what's happening. So I have some bullet points I would like to share with you guys and maybe kick off some conversations here. First thing is that we are talking about a lot of different information environments. But I think in all of them, when you talked about like 2024 as a year of lots of elections, like Brazil, India, the US, all of those environments are already quote unquote digital. So the digital part of people's information diet are already prevalent, and people are consuming internet, consuming social media at the same time that they are consuming radio, TV, and everything. So it's part of the diet that people feed in information. And because of that, campaigns like to be where the people are. campaigns like to reach electors, citizens. They need to. This is the why they exist, right? So if a society is already digitalized or digitized or whatever, campaigns are they are networked, they are platformized. So they do not function anymore as campaigns that we saw in the 90s, for example, where you have like this professional marketing company controlling every part of the candidate discourse and having control on a few mass media components that you could like insert your strategy. So these platforms are a big part of them are user-generated content platforms with some kind of recommendation system, and this kind of transition elections into a much more complex environment where the candidate is definitely a key part of the network, but it's not like the controller of all of the messages that are circulating. They need to interact with that. And of course, each country has a different media environment. So people are consuming different media or different kind of platforms for different purposes. For example, in Brazil, WhatsApp is huge. In the US, it's not that huge. And people use WhatsApp in Brazil different as they use Telegram. So every part of that means something. And with the evolution of AI, so it's important to say that on these platforms, for example, for recommending content, AI is already used. So we do have AI as part of our ecosystem before the generative AI appeared in the stage. So in 2022, we have the launching of ChatGPT, so GPT 3.5. Generative AI start to hype a lot. We have this new kind of platform. So what scholars, researchers, observers are pointing out on this year and a half, I will try to summarize in 1 minute or 2 minutes for us to bring some discussion on it. The first one is like the critical evolution to create what we call synthetic content. So content that is spilled out from generative AI systems without only inserting a prompt on those systems. So we're talking about text, images, and now video. So this is now super cheap and is accessible by agents that were not in control of some kind of a capacity before those systems appear. And people see this as the great evolution that generative AI companies or platforms provide to the media ecosystem or to the information ecosystem regarding the political communication. But this is not only the one or exclusive element that is part of the conversation. Now campaigns have those tools for a number of functions, a number of tasks that they can bring together AI to cut costs, to micro-target with a more precision or accuracy. They can automate tasks that campaign were having. For example, to create a route for distributing your campaign materials offline. So this is something that for example, generative AI can help you a lot. But not only, this is just an example. So you have an enhance of key capacities, and we are not only talking about content creation, but also different kinds of capacities. And so this can change lots of things. People fear that we can have like deep fakes everywhere. This could cut costs of campaigning. We have some examples of elections that already passed through experiences of AI use. So we have Slovakia and Argentina that are examples that maybe we can discuss a little bit here in our discussion. And to end my first contribution, there is an important divide or an important difference between two parts of this discussion, especially around content creation, that maybe it is useful for us for sparking different reflections on that. So the first one is production. So companies just like OpenAI or Google that have this generative AI machines that can produce content with certain capabilities and with certain limits. So this is a part of the discussion. So how we deal with those kind of technologies of production. But we do have another part of it, which is distribution or non-distribution, containing distribution, which is what Meta or what TikTok or what even Google's YouTube, where they enter the conversation for discussing what kind of efforts that they have to have in order to create conditions to the dissemination, to the distribution of synthetic content. So maybe this is my contribution to kick off. I am eager for listening all of my colleagues on the panel. So I will leave it here.
Thank you, Chico. And just introducing here Andrea Lasevicius. Andrea is also a researcher at our research group, so it's great that I'm moderating this panel together with Andrea as well. But let's listen to our other panelists. I mean, any input or insights on how AI is changing our information environment, and why is it important at this point? I think and maybe some reactions to what Francisco is putting forward on synthetic content, challenges on distribution, and what is changing in this information environment with AI.
Whenever. Doesn't have to be now. So first,
jump
thank
in,
you
Clara.
so much for inviting me. It's really great to talk to Francisco, to Claire, and Magna. It's also really nice to meet you all. So I anticipated Chico would give us this really nice picture of the challenges we're facing when we talk about AI being influencing our information environment. So there were two things, and they're kind of not as nice, not so nice things to bring about, but someone has to do it. And the first one is that I think we still lack a lot of empirical evidence on this interface of AI and information systems, right? So we do have already some work that tries to understand how other mechanisms, or even some mechanisms in digital platforms that are sometimes mixed up with the concept of AI, how they influence decision-making, or if they travel faster or not, if they change voters' stances or not. And this empirical evidence is extremely disputed, right? We don't know yet how exactly to transfer what we know already about these systems to the context of AI. Will this mean a potentialization of the risks and results that we already see? We don't know yet. And which brings me to my second point, which is conceptual, right? So we don't know exactly how it will behave. What we do know is what we have learned so far about algorithmic curation and recommending systems. And sometimes what is perceived as AI also refers to these systems, because ultimately the term artificial intelligence is super loaded, but at the same time, not accurate enough for us to boil down this discussion to something a bit more objective and production, and then we can turn into public policy. So this conceptual mess has kind of been identified by the literature already and problematized in different ways. So some authors are going to stick with the techniques and refer to machine learning or large language models or neural networks. And other people will criticize the fact that this whole idea of AI is actually reflecting imaginaries rather than actually describing technologies per itself. And you also have people who will criticize the metaphor as, and this is neither intelligence or artificial, because at the end of the day, what you have is technologies that are being fed by human labor, basically. And then last week we had this op-ed in tech policy that says AI is basically outsourcing. This is a reference to the workers that are usually underpaid to basically do data work, a term that's already coined by sociologists who try to understand the dynamics of building the data sets that these technologies that we see nowadays influencing our communication environments count on. So this is my first input would be just to say that even though this all seems very new and it seems like we're facing a technological medium that we haven't faced before, it is still very much shaped by the same structures of power and domination that we have long known.
Super interesting, Clara. Thank you very much. Magna, please jump in.
Yeah. Just actually wanted to build on what Clara was saying, because she kind of took the words right out of my brain, and because I was thinking about the Indian context, and there really is no data over here. It is almost completely what we know about AI and what we know about the usage of deepfakes, particularly for elections or in any other context, is purely anecdotal, and is usually kind of provided by news reports. And when you think about the information context or the context of the information environment, yes, on the one hand, it is global because most of these companies operate across jurisdictions, but at the same time, it is also very local, and you have to consider how the other media within an environment is already operating and kind of feeding into either a misinformation, disinformation cycle. And I'm thinking very clearly about our Indian context where, there have been multiple instances of the mainstream media kind of contributing to that. When you think about the main kinds of considerations regarding deepfakes in the context of India, speaking in a political context, it's basically two things. Candidates tend to either use them to enhance their political image or to kind of denigrate that of their opponents. And I guess we'll get to more of this later on, but the interesting thing is that a lot of it happens offline, or at least the transactional element of it happens offline, where there are multiple companies offering these services and politicians kind of go up to them and ask them to engage in their campaigns. I think another thing that we possibly need to think about, since we are talking about the distribution aspect of this as well, and the kind of attribution to targeting as the primary vehicle of that is one, to what extent is AI or is misinformation or disinformation disseminated by AI different from what is from other forms of whether it's textual or audio or visual. There are some there's a study from the US, in fact, that indicates that it isn't very different. But then again, the polity in the US, I think, is very different from the polity in other jurisdictions, and I'd like to know how people would perceive such differences in the context of my country or even in the context of the global South. Another really interesting thing that has emerged from research again in the US is that the more incredulous or the more outrageous a claim that seems to be in terms of either a misinformation, disinformation campaign, particularly in the context of deepfakes, the less, it's empirical, the lower its empirical kind of credibility or digestibility. But again, I don't know how that would be received over here. So yeah, I think Tara said it best, where she said there's not enough data, there's not enough empirical evidence. And particularly from the global South, I would say that, or at least from my country, I would say that there is not enough evidence. And I think that is something that we have to work towards. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, and I'm happy to add that, I mean, we don't have a good empirical foundation at all, even though all of this money has flowed in mostly to the US to study misinformation in elections. We know that if we do survey work and we have the numbers, we tend to find null effects. When you start doing work with niche communities, that's where you start to see the effects, right? So you go to these conferences where there's lots of people who say, no, misinformation isn't a problem at all. And then you have other people saying, it's such, you know, and so we have this challenge anyway. But I would just say, it's so lovely to be here with all of you having this conversation. But I'll absolutely echo again, I do get frustrated. I get calls from journalists every day who are like, I want to talk about deepfakes in the elections. And I say, cheap fakes are still a massive problem. They have not gone away. It's the same dynamics. And I find this over emphasis on this new form of technology as opposed to it's an evolution. And we still have significant issues around the challenges we have around just photoshopping, or as we know, lots of genuine content used out of context. And I think it's really important we keep talking about different political populations. Division and polarization in the US is extraordinary. And so actually, when I think about the election in November, I think we'll see a lot of genuine content that reinforces people's existing worldviews. So if you think that the electoral process can't be trusted, somebody only has to take an actual photograph of the messiness of democracy, a really long line, an overflowing ballot box, some confusion. That's just democracy. But if you already believe that the system can't be trusted, I don't have to manipulate anything. I just take photographs of what's out there. So I think this, you know, I call that malinformation. I think we're going to see more of that. Like I don't think actually in the US, the problem is disinformation ahead of the election. If I was trying to cause problems right now and I had a whiteboard and I was making plans, my plans are from November 5th to Inauguration Day. How am I going to use manipulative techniques, whether it's cheap fakes or deep fakes, to just make people believe that nothing that they're seeing they can possibly believe with their own eyes? And that's my biggest concern about artificial intelligence and synthetic media is, and we're already seeing it. We are seeing it in the conflict in the Middle East, people saying, I no longer know what to trust. That, my friends, is the thing we need to be worried about. It's less about the technology of the creation and distribution. It's the fact that people are starting to say, I don't know who or what to trust. And so I'm not going to engage with any kind of media. I'm just going to turn inwards to my communities and to my family. So I think when we have these conversations about the elections, it's really to say, what does that look like in the context of trust in any kind of evidence disappearing? And my fear is, last thing, the more journalists write these headlines about, oh my goodness, that catastrophizing narrative is ultimately, I think, leading us to a place where the public is just like, oh, I give up with you people. And that is ultimately the most dangerous point I think we can get to.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you all in this first round. I think here, even that we have a lot of differences and approaches about this point, there is something that we have in a convergence regarding the importance of discussing this, even though other problems come together, and we have to definitely see this environment in a bigger and more complex way. And now in the second panel, we would like to keep in this election context to see other aspects that also come together when talking about AI, for example, these effects on public opinion, what are also the ethical implications of using AI in political campaigns, or even other aspects as journalism and media organizations regarding AI, the effects. And we would like, so in this second round, before going to the solutions and what we can do regarding this situation, to keep going a bit more in the problems and these very different, and even though we have things that are still the same, we have implications very complex to talk about. So I think, Clara, if you could start the second round with a kickoff about 6 or 8 minutes, I think it would be really nice. So please, you have the word.
Absolutely. So I was asked for an input on AI in elections, also considering the Brazilian debate and the Brazilian election that we have this year and eventually the next presidential one. So I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I think I speak for Chico as well in this. We were part of a committee of experts nominated by the Electoral Court to consult on a series of measures regarding what can be understood as elections digital integrity. And just to say that whatever I manifest here is my own opinion and does not represent the commission or much less the Electoral Court in any degree. That said, I'm going to jump right in and say that I think that in Brazil, we have a specific regime for freedom of expression during the electoral period. I don't think we should assume that whatever standard we have outside of that, whether jurisprudential or legal, will directly apply to the electoral period without any influence of a specific legal regime. And this also applies to the interface of AI and public communications during elections. What are we concerned about when we talk about AI during elections? So it's basically many of the things that are already referred to how AI can influence public debates or the public sphere. I'm going to borrow from Andreas Junger and Ralf Schroeder here because they have this very quick and easy typology of concerns. So in the first place, how AI can shape information and behavior, arguably, but yeah, let's say information and behavior online. They're talking here about the data-driven recommender systems that determine which information to display and how. The second one, a concern with automated content generation. So here's a quality control issue in the public arena, and a particular concern with potentially increasing the amount of disinformation circulating, especially deepfakes, as these debates are currently shaped. And a third concern of AI as an agent of communication, thinking about chatbots and voice assistants. So as I'm sure most of you know, we widely don't have standards to regulate that in the Brazilian legislation. We don't even have an overarching legislation, let alone an electoral one that treats these aspects. In Europe, the DSA provides some standards for that. We can argue that the AI Act does as well. As we already mentioned, we're still missing a lot of empirical research on this interface. But what we do have is very pressing concerns, particularly in electoral periods. Some of them Claire has already addressed in her first input. And if we look at the greater context, we're also talking about elections taking place in experience that have watched in the last year a decay in democratic conquest, an incremental decay of democratic institutions. This process have been called different things in the literature: democratic erosion, democratic backsliding. And I would argue that Brazil makes for a pretty good case of democratic backsliding. So that said, standards for free speech during elections vary across experiences. As I told you, I think we have a specific one in Brazil, which is justified by the fact that elections are indeed an exceptional moment in a representative democracy. It is not all that democracy is about. There, of course, there's more than representativeness, especially to a liberal democracy. But I think we can't argue that it's especially important for how most of these systems are organized. This special regime for freedom of expression in Brazil bears an extra reassurance that voters will have access to as much information as possible, with special standards to assess and sanction abuses to freedom of speech. It's almost contradictory. right? And for a long time, this regime has grounded specific measures like regulating electoral propaganda separately, like demanding broadcasting time, demanding access to broadcasters' programmation in order to show electoral propaganda and etc. Providing mechanisms to assess abuses to freedom of speech in this context. There's even a special jurisdiction, right? So we are talking about a special framework. And digital communications dynamics, and by this I mean the combo user-generated content and platforms' influence on information and attention fluxes, rather than on content necessarily itself, brings new concerns to this conversation. Can electoral content be micro-targeted? What does this mean for pluralism, for instance? Despite of being disinformation or not, like, should we be micro-targeting content during elections? To what extent should personal data fuel political campaigns? Does our data represent us to this degree, right? Does the data we generate in these systems represent us enough to determine what sort of political experience we are going to have ultimately online and offline? And also this question, should cheap fakes or deep fakes be allowed at all? And does it even make sense to ban them, right? How pervasive are these technologies or not? So I think this conversation needs to happen both in Parliament, but also in a regulatory level, as it is done by the electoral court in Brazil. And these decisions are, of course, up for disputes, but it is not enough for us to over-rely or basically rely on overarching standards or our general framework for freedom of expression. So to close and put things in perspective, I have 1 minute and something yet, and I will make it. We are talking about a one-off moment of democratic practice, right? But we also have a lot of literature exploring the ways in which AI could interact with our idea of political self-determination. So this is just to put things into perspective a little bit. There's an issue of private autonomy. It's a Habermasian framework, so bear with me. So there's an issue of private autonomy, right? We discuss all the time how our algorithmic bias might influence access to state provisions or even to fundamental rights. And we need to remember that these rights are basically the conditions for political participation and legitimation of our democratic systems, right? There's also an epistemic dimension that is about how machine learning could compete with democratic decision-making, as is, instead of deciding things collectively and discussing them as we do nowadays, will there be a point when these decisions will be made based on maths and probability, right? As these systems basically function. And what are the risks that this poses to political agency? And ultimately, there's a need to politicize these systems, right? To bring them to scrutiny and open the debate for a dispute over their terms. They are not at all, as I was saying, the first input, they are not at all in their final form. I wouldn't even say they are more sophisticated than ever. I'm sorry, I think they're still very much in the making and up for dispute. So how do we guarantee that civil society, that expertise has actually access to enough, I would say, I don't want to say power twice, but enough conditions to come and dispute these systems in a huge power imbalance with global tech companies. So yeah, so that would be my first input to this.
Thanks, Clara. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
Thank you, Clara. I think hearing you, we realize all the specific differences that, for example, Brazil have regarding freedom of speech. Now we, for example, are facing a conflict between STF, and Alexandre de Moraes and Elon Musk, and the freedom of speech regime in Brazil is something that is very different from US, for example. In this, we can see the reflections when we have platforms that they exist globally, and they have to decide, for example, politics and policies for all the world and all the different elections that are happening. So I think it would be very nice to also hear Magna and Claire and also Chico about these other jurisdictions and other contexts. And India and United States are having elections this year. So how things are going in these other places, I think we could make a bigger framework here. So if any of you could keep going, thank you.
Yeah, and like maybe trying to see how these many layers interact, right? Like the layer that Claire just pointed before on, like the distrust, this that all this messy information environment leads to, plus the micro-targeting and the polarization, plus the deep fakes that come with these new powerful technologies. So what we're seeing is not one layer of issues, but changes in multiple layers that interact among themselves, I think. And so like maybe trying to understand further how this is going on in these different jurisdictions could be a very good way of trying to structure this conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to come in on that. I think that's what makes this so hard, and I think is my frustration again with journalists, that it becomes a techno-determinist story as opposed to understanding all of this, that these trends were always already happening, and then the pandemic happened and made so many of those layers worse. Like I do think those of us who sit in so-called trusted institutions, whether that's universities, newsrooms, government agencies and ministries, I still don't think we've really grappled with what's happened around trust in institutions that were previously trusted. And I think, you know, to the point about WhatsApp isn't really used in the US, I mean, I think there's just a grappling now with how more and more people are spending time in closed spaces with people they trust and know, that has completely changed the way that people are seeking information. They turn to one another to ask, should I vaccinate my kids? You know, is it safe to vote? Is there mail-in ballots? You know, and as we've seen the degradation of Google search in the US because of AI, again, people are saying, I can't find the answers to my questions. So all of these things, to your point, are happening at the same time. But I loved, Clara, your point about how do we have the conversations about what does democracy look like? I think this disproportionate focus on deep fakes and disinformation is failing the population who already being impacted by the way that AI is being used to recruit people, the way that big corporations now relying entirely on that, police organizations relying on predictive algorithms, mortgage companies relying on predictive algorithms about who gets a mortgage. I mean, all of the ways that AI are affecting communities, yet the journalistic discourse is all about, oh my God, what if there's a deep fake of Joe Biden 2 days before the election? And I think, you know, just to say again, we have to understand how this technology fits into the wider ecosystem. Everybody talks about the Slovakian example. Well, that intersected with the fact that in Slovakia, they have a 48-hour blackout for journalists before elections. You can't take the technology without understanding what the media system is that this technology is sitting within. So, you know, for all of this, we should be zooming out to understand the wider environment around trust, communities, media systems, freedom of expression, regulatory frameworks. We can't just look at the technology. And so it makes for a good headline, but it's scratching the surface in terms of how we need to understand the problem.
Yeah, and it's really a challenge to face these problems, right? If we don't look at them in this bigger way, we can't find an answer. So, Francisco, the word is yours. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, I just raised my hand because Claire really made an excellent point on how the narrative about it's so hyped, like and how this is a problem. Like in my first comment, I try to like paint the picture of what people are saying, but it's not only about what people are saying about it, right? But what works and what doesn't work, and how democracy looks like, and how democracy don't look. And on that, I think a fair question is like, what is the problem? what is exactly the problem that we should have an intervention on it. One of the things that the Electoral Superior Court in Brazil did, and this like follow a huge discussion on a commercial ad that used a deep fake, was to ban deep fakes at all, even those deep fakes that were totally that could be labeled and totally non-real. For example, if you put a candidate as Spider-Man and being Spider-Man in a city, like, it's really difficult to believe that someone it is a Spider-Man and can like launch a web and crawl into buildings of a big city. Like, people know that this is not true. I mean, like, there's some hypothesis that people might not know, but like, even those examples that are really fantasy are now forbidden by our regulation. And I don't think that this is the problem, in my opinion, not in the court's opinion, but in my opinion, this is not the problem. And one thing that people do not think about also is what is the nature of, what is the feature of interventions that are going to be done. For example, if you ban things, people will trust more or trust less what is there and it's supposedly not banned. How people will interact with a ban, how people will interact with a label of AI content. This will raise trust, or this will, I don't know, decrease trust. Those questions about how interventions on this, how legal or regulatory interventions would have to be perceived, are so important as the perceptions on the content itself. Because when you do it, when you intervene, you are making the intervention part of the solution or maybe part of the problem. And we know, and I'll leave it here, but we know that all campaigns in all elections, at least that I know of, but like, we know that this is disseminated, that campaigns have what we call the side A and a side B. The side A is the one that appears to people, the formal channels, profiles that campaigns or candidates have, their official Facebook page, their official Instagram page. But I do know that we have a side B, so obscure, opaque operatives that are maybe remunerated by the campaign itself, but maybe remunerated by people that once that campaign succeeds, that are not disclosing their source, and that can have a sometimes illicit intervention on the campaign, so illicit operation during the campaign. So if you ban things, you cannot be certain that things will be banned at all. It's just like if you make something a crime, for example, killing people, people will continue to kill people. We have those crimes for many years. Those crimes did not ban behavior. They kind of make consequences for behavior. They help, in a sense, to create the perception of what is wrong and what is right. They are moral. They are the reflection of what society wants to have and what not. But banning things will not, it's not equal to solving the problem, for example. So just some things about like what we want as a democracy too, and following Clara's question.
Yeah, and thinking what Clara said, that we are not in the end of this technology, it's still evolving a lot. And even though like for some people, this is the first elections that have artificial intelligence, and we know it's not. So there's also this thing that we don't have how we deal with the time to regulate and the time that the pools are happening. But the answer that we were surprised with how fast things changed. It doesn't make sense if we think that these are things that are happening for a long time, and regulation should like have all the elements and the processes and the discussions that you said, for example, Francisco, about these points. So Magna, if you want to make some points here, you feel free.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it kind of touches upon both what Claire said and what Francisco said, because I see knee-jerk reactions, or I see the media cycle as contributing to knee-jerk reactions, which result in bans and technologies. We've seen it a bunch over here. In fact, and basically how it kind of translates is we have a state apparatus that acknowledges that there is a crisis of capacity within it. And if you have interactions with officers individually, they will acknowledge that there are significant technical deficiencies that they are dealing with. And then you have a media cycle that wants to talk about AI because it's buzzy, and because they basically want to generate clickbait. So you have AI in the news constantly, it's constantly in the news cycle. And then it translates into the kind of ban that Francisco was talking about, or things like this AI advisory that came out a couple of months ago in India, where basically you could not introduce any form of AI in the country without a license. It was an unenforceable advisory. Not legally tenable at all, but basically it was a knee-jerk reaction to what was essentially a news cycle revolving around a couple of deepfakes that got significant traction because they were targeting actresses in the country. I'm not saying that the deepfakes targeting actresses is not a problem. I think the way that regulation is approached as a reaction to the news cycle, because essentially you're dealing with the political machinery in the state that is concerned about how it is being perceived and how particularly perceptions around its capability in terms of governance, how that kind of interacts with the entire information cycle and new technologies coming in, etc. The other concern, and I guess we've kind of jumped into the third section of this discussion, is how to what extent is it reasonable to expect political parties to be objective in terms of regulatory decision making when it comes to mechanisms that further their political ambitions? And I think that is something that is kind of missing when you think about when I think about the discussions around intermediary governance in India. Of course, there is a literature to suggest that disclosures around misinformation kind of heighten the level of distrust, but we don't know what the baseline, and I think all of us have touched upon it, what the baseline level of trust is within our jurisdictions. To what extent are we trusting information, and which demographics, what is the level of trust across different demographics? So speaking about WhatsApp, we have this kind of pejorative term where we call someone a WhatsApp uncle or a WhatsApp auntie, where basically all their information comes from WhatsApp forwards, and they're very happy to kind of, share it with you as the gospel truth. So, I mean, my point is, again, I guess, this is going to be a constant refrain where we don't know what the baseline level of trust is. We don't, and I mean, there's no real investment in terms of gathering data around that. But also, to what extent can we expect not only state institutions, but even large technology companies to be objective in their approach to these information problems? Because once again, they do not operate outside any kind of political economy surrounding these issues. And I've seen this play out across multiple contexts in my jurisdiction. Most recently with the Gemini, there was an issue with the answer produced by Gemini in India, which was then rectified, where basically now it doesn't provide information around elections or electoral candidates. But to what extent, again, the question that emanates there is, what are people using these technologies for? So are people going to generative AI? So are they using ChatGPT and Gemini for information, to generate information, or to generate content, or help them in the production of content? And I think that is something else that we need to understand as well.
Yeah, I'll just
Thank
jump
you,
in
Meg.
quickly.
Yeah, go ahead, Claire.
To say we have a new news organization here run by Julia Angwin, who basically the first story was to test 5 LLMs with those kind of questions you're asking, Magna, like, can I go and vote with a red Make America Great hat, like a Trump hat? And the answer is no. But all of these LLMs, I think in total, the accuracy, 52% of the answers were just wrong. But when they asked the secretaries of state, who, you know, in every state are the electoral officials, they said what was shocking was how authoritative the answers sounded. Like, it was just wrong, but they sounded like they absolutely knew what they were doing. But I think, to your question, Megan, like, is that how citizens are going to find out? Are they using chatbots? And I don't know. So I think what we don't know here is, I don't think they are going, but I do think they're trusting one another in closed spaces. So we did some work in South Florida with Spanish-speaking diaspora communities. And the number one rumor was, is the election cancelled? Because Alexa had been answering, you know, the Google Alexa machine, to say that the election was cancelled. Amazon has now changed, but that rumor spread like wildfire in WhatsApp groups. So you only need one person to get a bad response from a chatbot, and the damage comes from people themselves sharing it. So it's, again, the interplay between the technology and the social.
That's super interesting, Claire. Thank you. And I think having this in mind of how the interaction between the social and the technology is really what shapes our information environment. It's not only the technology, nor only the social, right? So I think that's a great point. And so maybe we can move to a last block, and before we open also to a few questions, and trying to see how we can face some of these challenges. I know that for most part, and there's some agreement, I think, from what I heard, that this is not completely new and that AI is not changing everything. But it is certain that AI is bringing new layers of complexity to this, right? So, and I think the question is, and these new layers can be like more credible deepfakes, or it can be like synthetic content in a more intense manner that is created and shared, and different algorithms for sharing and micro-targeting disinformation, so on and so forth. So we're going to see like new layers of this discussion going on. And the question here is, what are the types of reactions? Like, we see reactions like in Brazil, like electoral courts trying to intervene, even with banning of certain contents, as Francisco was questioning whether this is useful at all. We see lots of discussions on self-regulation by platforms that also influence content moderation, how this content moderation is done. We see other initiatives of third parties participating in this moderation contracts, like the trusted flaggers in the Digital Service Act in the EU. But there are many different potential reactions to these issues in the information environment, especially in elections. And I'd like to hear you, how you see these interventions and these potential regulatory reactions, whether, and that was a question that I posed, whether is it possible for governments that are potentially impacted, and they're always impacted by this information environment, to have an objective perspective on this. And third, I think it's a point that Francisco also mentioned, is that the interventions themselves are part of the information environment, right? So when the electoral court takes a decision during elections, that becomes part of the discourse of the candidates. So none of what we do is outside of the information environment. In an Archimedean point that somebody's watching what's happening and making an intervention. It's an intervention that's part of the debate always. So this makes it even more difficult to shape these interventions and these regulations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the potential ways to face some of these challenges. Some of them are pretty old at this point, like at least 15 years old, but others are newer, and how you see what we learned so far with these policy reactions. So maybe Claire, Magna, would you like to jump in and start with that discussion about how to face the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I just start by saying, I mean, we for the last 10 years kept thinking, oh, the platforms themselves are going to do self-regulation, and we've seen that hasn't happened. And we've seen that while the Digital Services Act coming out of Brussels isn't perfect, we've seen more movement in 6 months than we've seen in, 15 years. So I think, and I love this point about how can we expect politicians in country to regulate, and come up with rules that are going to not help them. So I do think looking at supranational bodies that could potentially think about some of this regulation. But this is a silly example, but I think about it all the time. In spring 2019, when the US had some measles outbreaks, the head of policy for Pinterest said, people come to Pinterest to plan weddings and kitchens. They do not come to Pinterest to plan vaccinating their children. So we will have no vaccine information on our site. And I think the same for AI systems right now. I wish OpenAI would say, we are getting better, but we are nowhere near being ready for elections. So therefore, nobody should be able to ask any questions related to elections or candidates. Like that to me seems the bare minimum for this year. Like that, you're going to make a ton of money, OpenAI, doing a ton of things. Do not get involved in elections. Because when Facebook in 2010 was going out and training candidates around the world to use Facebook for election campaigns, they just kept saying, this is how advertising works on Facebook. And I kept thinking, that's how you advertise toothpaste. But advertising for toothpaste is not the same as political advertising. It's fundamentally different and much more dangerous. And I feel like we're making the exact same mistakes again of just thinking that technology is neutral and it applies similarly to marketing products as, playing a key integral role in a democracy. So I would love to see these platforms just say, we are not ready in 2024, maybe 2028, but they're not going to do it. But we can't create the regulation in time. So I wish they would be the ones to be the grown-ups in the room and say, our technology is not ready. Anyway, that's my rant.
Thank you, Claire. Magna, please jump in.
Sorry, kind of jumped ahead. Yeah, thank you, Claire. Actually, I want to kind of invert what you said in terms of the distinction between, marketing products and marketing, let's say, a political product or a political candidate. And the conflation of that when you think about some of the regulatory solutions that are being posited to limit the impact of, let's say, misinformation or large platforms and the dissemination power and distribution power of large platforms on democracy and democratic institutions and electoral processes. One thing that is kind of used or is kind of emerging as a theory is, antitrust, where basically you kind of try to disrupt the targeting potential of a platform. And there's a standard of democracy that, is used as kind of underpinning for that argument. But of course, there's a disruption of commercial processes as well. This is somewhat tangential to our discussion, but I think it's important to consider in terms of if we are working towards constructive solutions. I don't think we should look into far-flung doctrines like antitrust, which are about encouraging competition in a market to solve problems with democracy, because all I think you're going to do is create market failures in other areas. And we've done some work around that, about how, impacting targeting on platforms would adversely impact small firms that rely on these platforms for market access, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of solutions, we do in India, I'll first kind of go into what we have currently and then what we're kind of thinking about. So under our law, we have, there's an obligation for online intermediaries to take down any kind of morphed content within 24 hours of receipt of a notification. Now, of course, there is a tendency to try to misuse that provision as all kinds of obligations on intermediaries over here, where it might not be morphed, but it'll be alleged that it's morphed, etc., etc. So that is one element of it, which is why I kind of say, how can we kind of trust political actors to make objective decisions about regulating technological interventions or any kind of mechanism which helps them. The other thing, of course, that is being currently disputed in courts is the creation of a fact check unit, which will be kind of appointed by the government to decide on the truth of information related to what the government does, which, I think most people is fundamentally problematic. And that's why it's being disputed. And it's currently in the Supreme Court. One simple thing I think, of course, is bot disclosures. I don't know why it's taken so long, but we still don't know on mainstream accounts like Twitter, on mainstream platforms like Twitter, like Facebook, what's a bot and what's not. I think that is a simple, there are simple labeling things you can do. I understand that it could go negatively and it could work against, creating trust and engender essentially more distrust in the information environment, particularly if something is labeled wrongly, etc., which can happen as well, given that a lot of these companies are rolling back their fact-checking units, are rolling back their kind of governance of these of their own information environments. Although an interesting thing on that front is that a lot of that is a response to things like the Digital Services Act, where they're like, okay, fine, well, now this is the mechanism and you guys decide, and we are now not going to move towards self-regulation because, you've come out with this kind of comprehensive regulation. This is what we're going to do. So we're kind of going to roll back what we're doing. So I think from that, there's kind of a balance that has to come where basically there is an incentive created for companies to, or a nudge created for companies to kind of work towards creating trust. And again, that's very challenging. When I think about the context of India, it's very challenging to see how that would come about, given all the kinds of forces at play here. The last thing I kind of want to say is that in the context of AI governance, there are three ways to kind of think about it. When you think about it from a liability perspective, which is kind of how things are panning out over here. So one is, of course, intermediary liability, where, let's say an AI system or any system is kind of intermediating a transaction between two people. But in the context of ChatGPT and chatbots, you have publisher liability, essentially, where you have content that is being generated. But you also have user liability. And the third thing is user liability, where basically a user utilizes some system to, either generate unlawful content or unlawfully generate some harm. So I think we need to think about these paradigms and the attribution of kind of fault in these paradigms, because while it is tempting to place a lot of the onus on platforms, and certainly I think that there should be greater accountability there, I think it's also important to think about the fact that a lot of the traditional modes of governance, particularly when we're thinking about misinformation and how it's kind of evolving with these new technologies, is that you're moving from intermediation to publication. And you're moving to publication where the user has some part to play in terms of the generation of that information. And so you have then things like tortious liability that come in, and to what extent foreseeability plays a role. And foreseeability is a challenge in the context of AI, one, because of course there is a lack of explainability. But I mean, it could always be argued that it's not, because you could understand that there is a level of hallucination, et cetera, but you don't know what it is going to say. And of course, there are many contexts that arise where basically someone could give, let's say, ChatGPT a prompt where there's no way for OpenAI, or there was no way to establish that OpenAI could foresee a certain that outcome. So I think, yeah, lots to unbundle, but basically I think we need to think about liability in this context in a multi-dimensional way, because it's not just the platform mediating the interaction. Of course, of course, a majority of it is being mediated by the platform, but now you have a different kind of interplay between the user and a technological paradigm where there is a co-creation that is happening. So I think we need to kind of adjust to, one, see whether existing frameworks can tackle, or existing both doctrines and frameworks can tackle that kind of liability or that kind of consideration. And if not, then what is the kind of path forward towards that?
Thank you, Megan and Claire. I think these are all interesting issues. I mean, Claire's point on should we have a pause and say, look, let's wait until these technologies and these new tools are used in elections, right? And then Magna's point on having a discussion of whether regulation may also impact or negatively impact efforts of self-moderation, right, of self-regulation that leads to better moderation to a certain extent. So a hands-off approach comes out of whenever regulation kicks in, platforms are more in a hands-off approach or not, right? And these discussion on liabilities, I think, are fascinating because it is changing what's the role of each user and the technology and the content that's being generated as well. But then if we could hear Clara and Chico here on quick reactions so that we can have some time for questions and answers as well, but like your reactions on these different ways to face the challenges that we're seeing.
I'm going to be very, very brief because I want to hear the questions. Yes, I think these are great points as well. I'm a legal scholar, so I look a lot at the remedies from the perspective of regulation, what exactly is required out of regulation. I have established as a ground zero for my analysis in the sense that it's not about regulating content. It's not about abuses to freedom of speech single-handedly, as in I struggle with the idea, for instance, of having a concept of disinformation in law, because it implies that there is one version of the truth that is absolute and that should be imposed. But I do think what we really need to do is regulate these fluxes of information, of digital information, that are still very much outside of our legal systems. So regulate data and actually have a real conversation about can and what cannot be done with data. I think in a similar sense of let's have a real conversation of what AI should and should not be used for. Let's also have a big conversation about what can and cannot be done with people's data. And also let's regulate these opaque fluxes of information, right? Where is this information going? The DSA, I think I really like Magna's perspective, but the hands-off thing, I struggle with that. I think regulation is super necessary, and I think that the hands are already off, right? And in my opinion, we need to move forward with the regulatory debate. The DSA is not perfect, of course, but it's such an important step, in actually experimenting mechanisms and their potential to bring online communications closer to public values, I would say. The last thing I'll say about this is that all of this is extremely contingent on context, right? I have a recent research on what disinformation countermeasures look like in different countries. And this is super dependent on political context. So in Brazil, we had the Bolsonaro experience. It's very much associated with state propaganda. Currently in the US, within the Biden administration, it's seen as a way to attack the government and not as something coming from the government. And we even have with the Moldova experience and other Eastern Europe countries where disinformation is equal external interference. So it's also seen as a war strategy, and whatever countermeasure comes is really dependent on what are the political interests that are defining the public debate in these places. So this would be my last one, and I would really like to hear the Chico, of course, in the questions.
I'll try to be brief too. So I think that we need to figure it out what is exactly jumping out, or like stop working with politics, because like so for example, OpenAI said that they are not they are banning campaigns from using it. But what happens if someone that is associated with a campaign but is not disclosing that are associated with a campaign, but tries to use ChatGPT for a purpose that is not openly political but will influence politics? It's very difficult to know in advance. So I think that we need a deeper conversation on what is exactly political we use, what is exactly political content. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is that I think that dividing the problem into production and distribution does not solve all the questions, but at least organize the dialogue and the engagement that we need to have with those different stakeholders. So, for example, in the production side, I don't think it's not only about the guardrails for producing synthetic content, but also on how those systems are going to be prepared or not to be asked about news, if they're licensing news content or not, if they're licensing fact checking or not, who are the sources that they are going to use to train their algorithms for it, and if they're going to compensate well journalists that do this work, for example. So there is this side of the question about production and how those systems are going to be prepared to be prompt about issues around elections, for example. So if you have like an embarked ChatGPT in your WhatsApp, it's very naive to think that people would not ask this ChatGPT thing when's going to be the voting, or what are the news about yesterday, and like people would do that. So are the systems going to be prepared or not? So and of course all of the questions regarding synthetic content and guardrails for producing them or not. And the distribution part of it, I think that so this open up those discussions around content moderation that I think everyone here is already kind of figuring out what's the best answer, right? But if someone, in my opinion, is true about this, is that good content moderation requires investment and effort. So you're not doing good content moderation if you're not investing enough. And what is possibly gonna happen for the next 2 years or so is that all of those regulations in the north, especially in Europe, can be very interesting to explore alternatives in those contexts, but at the same time, they are already causing a diminishing investments in contexts that are not as strong geopolitically to enforce legislation that demands investments on those contexts too. So I'm afraid that the DSA concentrates investments in content moderation while pressure for why there is a pressing issue all over the world to update those systems and catch up with the capacities that agents are going to have to develop influence operations in different contexts. But I'm looking forward for the questions.
Magna, please go ahead, and please, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat or just raise your hand and you can open the camera. I mean, feel absolutely free. We have a few minutes for questions and answers. Go ahead, Magna.
Yeah, just a quick clarification. Sorry, I wasn't really advocating for a hands-off approach. I was just saying that, you know, accounting for the kind of unintended effects of regulation when a regulation comes in, and let's say there is a decrease in investment in an area that the regulation is targeting, or a decrease in effort in regulation that is targeting, essentially. How can we create mechanisms to respond to those kind of unintended effects so that we have more robust and positive outcomes? So in the context of content moderation, and the context of greater accountability of information ecosystems, particularly on large platforms, how can we nudge platforms towards you know, taking greater accountability for their own information ecosystems? And that also kind of plays into the whole debate between publishers and platforms, and you know, the multiple jurisdictions where these laws have come out, where basically platforms are required to pay publishers for links, and essentially what you have platforms do is kind of de-platform news publications, and there's plenty of research to show that it has a counterproductive effect in terms of the robustness of electoral democracy, particularly during elections. So that was just my limited intervention there. Just wasn't advocating for a hands-off approach.
Fully understood, Mike. I think it's very clear. Questions, comments. We do have a few minutes, and it'd be great to hear from some in the audience as well. But of course, Andrea and I have lots of questions and comments here as well. But I mean, we'd love to hear from people that have joined us and followed the debate. And we also ask questions in Portuguese and can translate here as well. Feel free to ask.
While people are still thinking about questions, I would like to ask something that Clara said about data. I think this is a very essential point. And in two different aspects, my question is going to be, like, first of all, what are the ethical and political challenges that we are facing when regulating this access to data during the electoral processes, but also how we are seeing some discontinuation of tools for content monitoring, like CrowdTangle of Meta and other forms of restrictions on access to data by the technologies companies. So how these affect also the ability to monitor online disinformation and misinformation around elections. This is not only for Clara, but to everyone. Thank you.
I'm going to start. I think there are very different concerns here around this question. The first one is this discussion about what sort of data should be used to micro-target or to to curate access to content during elections and outside of elections as well. There, you asked me about the political and ethical implications. There are so many, right? It's not only about an idea, what is the idea of privacy that we want to preserve, but also about the epistemic power in data, right? Like, should these economic actors hold this epistemic power that comes with data, over what we do, over individual and collective behavior, and etc. And I think that even though I mentioned in my last input that the DSA has taken so many important steps towards this discussion and regulatory experimentation, I think this question is kind of the one that regulators avoid, you know, because it speaks so deeply to the business model. It speaks so deeply to a certain version of capitalism that is also popular in the literature as surveillance capitalism, and etc. That I think this is the question that we're failing to address more drastically. In another sense that, of the concerns that you mentioned access to data, and this is indeed a huge concern for researchers, right? How they need access to data in order to understand these platforms, their business models, their social, political, economical implications. And indeed, we see, I think the movement of platforms shutting down access to data, and even product safety and policy teams that were before, that were there before. I don't think it's something we can pin on regulation specifically, but also not sure if we should not. I'm all on board on like there's never one single factor in place, either the technology or whatever circumstance, right? So the fact is that we have this movement. At the same time, we have this regulatory experimentation of the DSA of imposing an obligation for them to give access to data in certain circumstances, right? It's not an ample access, a general access, but an access that is justified under certain circumstances. This will also face a huge enforcement battle. We already have some people requesting data. Most of the requests have been denied. There's also a political battle here in the European Union, meaning that different digital service coordinators that are on the national level are actually the people responsible for processing these requests. And of course, there are imbalances between different countries. You know, certain countries are known for being more, more permeável in Portuguese. They're more prone to listen to big tech concerns and etc., while others are not so much. So this is also an issue that has been tackled by the regulation, but still facing facing the power structures in order to generate some actual results.
Thank you, Clara. If any other panelists have some input here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just very quickly say again, thinking about particular contexts, I mean, the US just has no privacy whatsoever. I mean, it was amazing to me as a European moving here, and the availability of personal data is astonishing to me. And Americans, because it's the norm, don't question it. But exactly to this question about targeting, we saw in 2016 the way that Trump was targeting voters in Wisconsin and putting them into categories of who it would be most easy to suppress their vote based on their voting histories. You know, that kind of level of targeting and available voter rolls is something in the US that's deeply troubling. So when I think about the ways that synthetic media could be targeted at a hyper-local level, I mean, I think about robocalls, not of Joe Biden, but a robocall of a local faith leader, or a robocall of the person who coaches the football team, like locally trusted, hyper-targeted to people based on their voting behavior. That's when it starts to get really worrying. And I couldn't imagine the same in the UK, because we don't have that kind of data is not available on people because we have higher levels of privacy. So I think this question of how data intersects with AI is critical and is not being discussed because the focus is on the content as opposed to the ways in which it will be targeted. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with Clara on that.
Super interesting. I think that's really a great point. Any other questions, issues? And while we see if anybody is willing to raise questions here, One issue in collaboration, international collaboration. How do you see international collaboration in this area? As we see if there is anybody else that wants to ask a question. Especially because I think what we're looking at this point is more of different levels of experimentation than really any attempt of convergence in this point, right? So I think we're trying to learn from experimentation more than try to converge into a single model, or be it DSA or any other one. So that poses a new challenge as well here. But let's listen to Antonio as well, and we can have a wrap-up session here with comments from all other panelists.
Hello, everyone. Just adding on top of Caio's question about global cooperation, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the impacts of data portability and platform integrations that might impact disinformation. I'm thinking, for instance, if we think of the possibility of portability of data between WhatsApp and GPT, or, I mean, concerns that affect competition might translate into uses of data and AI that could amplify concerns with democracy. I don't know if I made myself clear, but if there are any thoughts on this, I would love to hear.
Thank you, Antonio. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor over to our panelists. Please do feel free to address any of these issues and also make your final comments so that we can have a final round of comments from you. Thank you very much. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to start. Just I don't have a good answer to that question, but I think last week when we saw how the platforms have basically been scraping each other, I mean, there is not an ethical bone in their bodies, right? They have been attacking independent tech researchers because we've been scraping their data for years, and they've been scraping each other's data to train these models. I mean, they have zero ethics. They're going to do whatever they need to do. So I think going back to this question of what do we do moving forwards, we have to recognize it's not going to come from the platforms. You know, I have friends inside the platforms that say they are just launching these things because of FOMO. They're watching each other. They're launching these products too early because they're terrified of losing market share. It is just a disaster. On top of years of knowing how they move fast and broke things, we're just seeing the same mistakes made again. We're seeing a complete failure of interacting with civil society and understanding different global contexts. So I'll just say, in terms of data portability and other things, there are really smart things we could be doing, but it's not going to come from the platforms. And I worry it's not going to come from our regulatory frameworks as is. So it's deeply depressing to have the same conversations. We could be having this conversation about in 2018. It would sound the same around social media, but it just happens to be around artificial intelligence. So not to be depressed, but this fundamentally, we have to come up with other ways of thinking about building community resilience and other things, because we are not going to get what we want from the platforms. And I'm worried that we also just don't have transnational regulatory regimes that could do this either. But maybe I'm just having a bad Tuesday.
I'm going to take over because I need to leave soon to pick up my kid from school. Not to be depressed, but, you know, not to make everyone depressed, but kind of like it's very depressing. I'm also super skeptical regarding transnational solutions. I participated in a panel about that in the IGF last year. And there was this whole conversation about how what we have learned about internet governance and multi-stakeholder risk governance could possibly contribute to the topic. I see it so, as I mentioned before, so entangled in social political context that I struggle a bit with the idea. And also, it's like, as it has been mentioned several times here today, what is that? What these very different contexts have in common is the technology, right? Which we kind of agreed on that it's not exactly what's making the difference here, not to mention power struggles. So I always actually, I did an interview this week, and this was the question, like, what is the difference between regulating platforms in Europe and regulating them in Brazil? The way they behave in the dispute for regulation, in terms of rhetorics, in terms of the extent of efforts they are willing to put in fighting back regulation, is really, like, we have learned a lot in Brazil in the last year in terms of imbalances of power. So I'm also not super optimistic with transnational solutions. I think I'm a bit more optimistic with regulation, just because I think it needs to keep pushing for it. It has proven extremely hard to conquer. It has been proven extremely hard to dispute, even in Brazil, right? We have these waves of movements of regulation. We just had a huge thing with an external provocation from Elon Musk. And still, our debate doesn't seem to move forward in terms of what is the legal framework that we're going to have. But I don't think we have another way that is not disputing that and holding people accountable for making that happen, right? So that's where I would put my money, I guess.
Thank you.
Also, if this is my last intervention, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me. This has been super nice to talk to you and to get to know your group's work too on these topics. I really look forward to exchanging with all of you again.
Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you for making the time to be with us as well. And feel absolutely free. I know you have a commitment to pick up your kids, so feel absolutely free to leave us whenever you need to. But I'd like to have a very brief last round with Francisco and Magna, please, and then we close here.
So two things. First one is now dealing with a possible AI Act in Brazil. So this is being discussed in the Senate now, and one learning of that process is that if it's difficult to regulate platforms itself in a DSA-like effort, I think it's 5 times more difficult to regulate AI, especially because of the number of special interests that are engaged on this discussion. I mean, finance, health, the government branches, like in a different stance, like people from the education department, people from like everyone is interested on that, and you have like a number of lobbyists that are exponential to the number that we are seeing in platform regulation. So I think things are a lot more complicated, and especially when you have like this race to the top that countries are willing to participate in. So in the platform environment, we are taking for granted the platforms that are already have this market share and that are already prevalent in different contexts. And we are not seeing governments wanting, at least in Brazil, for example, they're not wanting to build a new platform. But in AI, they want to participate in the wealth that is going to be generated on that. And this drives the discussion and drives the negotiation differently. And of course, this has impact on the global stage. So all of the discussions around energy, for example, are not present in the platform governance discussions, but now are present on the AI discussions. So high risk classification. So all of that, it's a different battlefield, and with different and multiple interests that are present. So this is the first thing that I would like to flag, and I think that this impacts the way that we are going to have this discussion. And the second one is, I think that since there is this production part of it, I think that we have a homework to do, which is getting deeper on figuring out what are the structures in place to sustain the production of good and trustworthy information, and how this is going to be fed into the system, fed into the ecosystem. So all of the discussions around remuneration, compensation for journalism, or regulating licensing, like this is not only legacy media fighting back. It is also legacy media fighting back the loss of revenue that they have with the rise of platforms, especially in advertising, with advertising businesses. But now we're talking about like crappy content that can be produced in scale, and like cheap. I'm not even talking about deep fakes or cheap fakes. I'm talking about content itself, like text, that can be manipulated and produced at scale. And I don't think that we have a good solution for providing the adequate amount of resources for producing content that is going to respond to the human rights that people have to access information about what's happening and to make decisions about it. So I think that this part of the homework is pending, especially in Brazil and even in other countries that had a problem with media before and about concentration, about access to information, and never solve it on the past, and now are having to deal with kind of two problems at the same time. So just to flag it out, I think this is super important, and it's been a pleasure for being here. Like I'm super happy that I was able to hear Claire, Magna, and Clara. This event idea was awesome. So thank you, Caio and Andrea, and nice to be here.
Thanks, Francisco. Our pleasure. Magna, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to kind of not play devil's advocate, but just kind of throw perhaps what it may be an unpopular opinion into the ring, which is basically that if we think about platforms, or if we think about these solutions or solutions to these problems in terms of restricting access to data, the flip side of that is I think we make these information environments, or there's a danger that these information environments might become somewhat exclusionary. Because if data is not the medium of exchange, then are we looking at subscription-based platforms? And in that context, I know it's not a binary, but until there is another medium of exchange created, and I'm not saying that surveillance capitalism is the way, but if you think about it, most media, all traditional media, and definitely social media, runs on advertisements, the cross subsidy from advertisements, and that is basically an information. That is by its very essence, kind of information capitalism. Traditional media, of course, accrued a form of it, and the sophistication kind of came about with the advent of social media and targeted advertising. And why I say that is because majority of people in my country would not be able to afford access to information ecosystems that were subscription based. And so then do we create this danger of having this kind of exclusionary ecosystem, or this these excluded people that then only can turn to what may be an information ecosystem or traditional media that is somewhat compromised because a majority of them are owned by business entities and so on and so forth. And when I think about it in terms of, because we have no data, I think it's important to understand to what extent the engagement of the average Indian, and I know I keep coming back to my country's context, but that it kind of is what's most relevant and resonant to me. To what extent people are engaging with technology and, you know, are being influenced by the information that they are receiving as a consequence of the targeting. And like when I think about, I mean, Claire, to your point, and actually to everyone's point, when you think about when we were talking about the kind of objectivity of governments in terms of bringing out regulation, we had a Data Protection Act that was basically passed by Parliament last year, but it hasn't entered into force and is unlikely to enter into force until after our elections end, which, you know, kind of feeds into that question of objectivity when it comes to regulating mechanisms that may support your political ambitions. So, I mean, going back to it, I think that we need to think about data-led solutions or restriction to data more holistically, because there are also speech implications that are that come into play. So, for instance, let's say you make a rule for, that's a crude rule, but let's say you make a rule for a platform that basically, you know, okay, fine, product targeting is fine, but political targeting is not. And so, but then what is political targeting? You know, where does then surrogacy come into it, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we have a solution. I don't think we will have one, because we are kind of wrestling with the nature of man and woman as a political animal. And it is a problem not only, let's say, in terms of the digital age or even the broadcasting age, but really as old as kind of the human condition itself. So I think that, you know, if we are going to talk about it in context of some kind of supranational regulation or agreement, while I agree that it's very challenging, how will you ever enforce it, et cetera, et cetera. Look at what's happening to multilateralism in the context of trade and the kind of, you know, the geopolitical fault lines that have formed, you know, in very clear pockets across the globe. But if we were to do it in that context, then of course there would be some kind of global compact, but I don't see certain countries adhering to it. So yeah, I think it is a depressing place that we will have to enter. But that being said, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed this discussion and look forward to staying in touch.
Thank you, Magna, and thank you to our panelists, Magna and Francisco and Claire and Clara that had to leave us, and Andrea who co-moderated this panel with me. It was a great pleasure to have this conversation. I think we need more of these conversations. I think like 10 years ago, we're seeing a lot of potential about the decentralization of content and how this would democratize the information environments. I think it's still true that to a certain extent we're distributing power in a different way. But I think we're facing new challenges, and challenges that are very difficult, as this conversation shows, to tackle and to actually come up with solutions. And there's going to be not one solution fits all, as this is highly dependent on each environment. So we're going to have to experiment, we're going to have to test, and we're going to have to see how different tools work and how they interact with each other. I think that's really what I take out of this conversation. That it is a huge challenge that we have had, but it's great to see and to have people like all of you thinking about this and helping to understand what's going on with the information environment and the new policy tools that are coming forward. So thank you again for joining us from different time zones, from different places in the world, and to join this conversation. I hope that we can cooperate in different areas as well. Thank you, Claire, Francisco, Magna.
Bye, everyone.